Thank you for joining us today. Amy and Kristi are here to explore ways to create an inclusive environment by providing you with an understanding of hearing loss and its effect on learning, what technology supports are available, how to implement accommodations, and how to promote self-esteem and advocacy skills. I'm going to ask everyone, if you haven't already, to mute your mics. That would be appreciated. And we're going to move forward. And Amy and Kristi, away you go.
Thank you so much, Susan. It is a pleasure being here today. So I'm just going to share my screen.
And Amanda, we're excited to see you.
I was excited to see you.
So before we begin, we would like to recognize the space, the place, and the lands on which we live and work and gather today. So we do have a land acknowledgement that one of the schools for the deaf and hard of hearing actually uses on this campus. So we thought it'd be a great opportunity to share with you. Okay.
And I'm just going to take over the screen sharing now.
So like Susan said, we are from the Ministry of Education with in the provincial and demonstration schools. So we do want to be really respectful of your time here. We know we only have about an hour with you, so we do want it to be very beneficial for you. So if there are any questions, please feel free to interrupt, ask questions, because we want it to benefit you as an educator as well. So this just kind of gives us an idea of where Kristi and I fit into the grand scheme of things. There are 3 schools for the deaf in Ontario. There are 3 schools for students with severe learning disabilities in Ontario. And then there's a school for the provincial blind, low, and deaf-blind students. So within each of those schools, there are resource services and there are resource service consultants who support daycares and students in the district school boards. That's where Kristi and I fit in. And then we also have colleagues who are resource service teachers who do a lot of early intervention and parent education. And they really focus on that 0 to age 4 for our deaf and hard of hearing students. So this is just a general overview of what we're hoping to cram into the hour that we have with you. So we're going to talk about understanding hearing and its effects it may have on our learners, being able to support the consistent use of well-functioning technology in your learning environment. And then we want to provide accommodations and strategies that you can use to promote and implement an inclusive learning environment for your students. So throughout this presentation, we're going to show some videos that are from the States, and you may see and hear the words hearing loss or hearing impairment. In Canada and in education specifically, we're trying to change that language to follow our deaf and hard of hearing colleagues' leadership. So we're changing the terms to hearing status, deaf, hard of hearing, hearing difference, and hearing levels are all acceptable terminology that we can be using in education. So let's talk quickly just about the human brain and the development, because we know it starts at a foundational level for these students. And we know that language is acquired naturally and effortlessly in the first 5 years of our learner's life. So what we know about incidental learning is that babies are actually acquiring 90% of language just through overseeing and overhearing what others are saying and doing in the environment around them. So when messages are received over and over, those connections are actually being made and those neural pathways are being formed. So baby's brain must be exposed to meaningful language consistently in order for those neural pathways in the brain to develop. So really, these early life experiences in infancy really lay the foundation for the development of language and literacy. And then therefore, they're really building that strong foundation for continued learning throughout a baby's life. So if you think about it, if a baby doesn't hear sounds well, maybe they have limited access to sounds due to their hearing level, maybe they have limited access to signed language, then that lack of exposure to a full first language can become a serious threat to a child's cognitive development. So foundational for building upon. So really, we want to make sure that we have to think about how access and exposure are different for our students that have a hearing difference. We're exposing them to language all day long because of all the languages happening around them, but we have to consider how much access to that language they have, whether it's signed or whether they're wearing a device.
Okay, so one statistic we usually like to share with people, it's a 2018 statistic, so hopefully we can get some more recent data soon. But the Ontario Infant Hearing Program reports approximately 4 in 1,000 babies will be identified at birth with some degree of hearing level or develop an early progressive childhood hearing difference. That number is actually larger when we think about unilateral hearing levels or hearing differences just on one side. Hearing levels which are due to ear infections, which can be fluctuating. So that means your kiddos might be hearing okay one week and then maybe not so great the next week. An important thing to remember for those kids not already identified with a hearing level when they start daycare or start school, that educators are often the ones who notice that something isn't quite right. So Infant Hearing Program does a great job of testing the hearing of a high percentage of babies if they're born in a center that has hearing screening, if they're not born during the global pandemic. But then a lot of families think that their child's hearing will always be fine then because they've had that test. The reality is that hearing differences can occur at any time for any number of reasons, and educators such as yourselves might be the first people to spot it. So we'll talk a little bit as we go through about look-fors that might indicate a student's having difficulty hearing or listening. We also have to remember that a lot of infant hearing programs weren't testing babies during COVID-19 shutdowns. For some of our more remote communities, those babies might not have been tested. And then they might not be identified until other red flags arise, like speech and language delays. And by then, we're already really far behind. As Amy was just talking about incidental learning, we're playing catch up at that point. So before we understand how hearing levels affect learning, I'm just going to share a video that shows how the auditory system works in general.
Have you ever wondered how sounds make their way from the source all the way to your brain? Take a trumpet, for instance. When it's played, it makes sound waves in the air. The outer ear catches the waves, which then travel through a narrow passageway called the ear canal. The sound waves reach the eardrum, which is a membrane roughly half the size of a dime. They make the eardrum vibrate, which in turn vibrates 3 tiny bones called the malleus, incus, and stapes. These bones amplify or increase the sound vibrations and send them to the cochlea. The cochlea is shaped like a snail and is the size of a garden pea. It is filled with fluid, and the sound vibrations make this fluid ripple, which creates waves. Hair-like structures called stereocilia sit on top of hair cells and are grouped together as hair cell bundles inside the cochlea. The hair cells inside the cochlea ride these waves, and the hair bundles are moved. The hair bundle on top of the hair cell turns these movements into electrical signals. As the hair bundles are moved, ions rush into the top of the hair cells, causing the release of chemicals at the bottom of the hair cells. The chemicals bind to the auditory nerve cells and create an electrical signal, which travels along the auditory nerve to the brain. Different hair cells respond to different frequencies of sound. The hair cells at the base of the cochlea detect higher-pitched sounds, such as a piccolo or flute. The hair cells toward the top of the spiral detect progressively lower-pitched sounds, such as a trumpet or trombone. At the very top or apex of the spiral, the hair cells detect the lowest-pitched sounds, such as a tuba. The auditory nerve carries the electrical signal to the brain, which interprets the messages as sounds that we recognize and understand.
So an amazingly sophisticated process. That whole process of hearing a sound should take 0.05 seconds in a system that's working well. So that's 10 times faster than we can even blink. So you can have many different types of hearing levels. There are conductive hearing levels or sensorineural hearing levels, and we'll talk about both of them. But basically, a hearing level refers to the sounds that a person can access with regards to loudness and pitch as displayed on an audiogram. So starting with conductive hearing levels, this is something that we're probably all familiar with, and that this is kind of how it works. So conductive levels are caused by an obstruction in the outer or middle ear, so anything up to this dotted line, that's blocking the transmission of sound. So as we saw in that video, sound is captured by your outer ear. It's funneled through to your ear canal. It vibrates your tympanic membrane or eardrum, which moves those 3 tiny bones in a chain reaction, and they further amplify and transmit the sound. So if any part of that system isn't working properly, you might have a conductive hearing difference. Some people are missing their outer or middle ear, which causes a conductive hearing difference. Oftentimes, a conductive hearing difference can resolve itself. So if you have an ear infection and you have antibiotics and the infection goes away, then the hearing returns to normal. If you have lots of fluid in your middle ear recurring and a baby gets tubes and the fluid drains, that can resolve that hearing issue. If you have impacted wax in your ear canal and that's removed, then that hearing level can return to normal again. So conductive hearing differences are often temporary. Those that are not temporary can be managed through hearing technology, like hearing aids. The thing to remember with conductive hearing differences is that if we make the sound loud enough, or if we bypass the outer and middle ear altogether, we still expect the brain to get the message as an intact whole. So when you're wearing earplugs, for example, if you're working around something loud, if someone tries to have a conversation with you and they speak loudly enough, you're still going to get that message to your brain. You've probably all experienced a conductive hearing difference in the form of an ear infection, either your own, with your kids, if you have kids, or kids that you work with. In the case of an ear infection with fluid, that eardrum can't move properly, can prevent sound from traveling correctly. Fluid is notoriously hard to get rid of, and it tends to get worse at this time of year. But fluid can be present without an ear infection. It can persist for weeks or months after an ear infection has cleared because antibiotics have no effect on fluid. So if a child has fluid that just doesn't go away, or many ear infections in a short period of time, that's often when we would hear of a child needing to get tubes to drain that fluid. And the important part for us as educators is that for those kids who have lots of ear infections or lots of fluid, how much time are they spending without being able to hear optimally? So even mild hearing difference, like that plugged ear hearing difference, can have significant impacts on a student's academic learning. So we often see these in our primary kiddos in the form of ear infection or in speech and language delays, but the effects last because they compound on the earlier effects to our junior intermediate and intermediate senior students. So those might be those kids who are labeled disruptive, who can't pay attention, who are having academic problems. For children who have hearing differences, listening doesn't happen easily or automatically like it might for you and me. It's a skill that has to be learned and explicitly taught.
So this is just a reason why your student may have a conductive hearing level. This is a condition called microtia. You can see it comes in different grades, but I'm going to show you a device that would help support those hearing levels for microtia. And then the next slide as well. And this is called atresia. So cosmetically, that the pinna is still there, but the ear canal is blocked, like Kristi was talking about, where it's happening in the outer or the middle ear. So this device would support a conductive hearing level because it transmits sound to the inner ear, so the intact inner ear. So a bone conduction hearing aid uses the skull bone for transmitting sound waves. So when our students are younger, you may see the soft band on top there. And that's just a non-surgical option to support a student with a conductive hearing level. There's a surgical option for this, and it just doesn't have that band to keep it in place because it has a little abutment that it snaps to. On the bottom picture, this is becoming a lot more popular for our older teenager adult groups as well, because it looks like headphones or sunglasses just being worn backwards. So you may see these types of devices in your learning environment to support a student that has a bone conduction, or sorry, a conductive hearing level.
So the next type of hearing difference that we often see when we work with kids is a sensory neural hearing difference. These are permanent hearing differences, and the cause is damaged or missing hair cells in the cochlea. So like those hair cells that we saw in the video. So they differ from conductive hearing differences in a few ways. One is that they're permanent, as I mentioned, and they also differ because making the sound louder doesn't fix the issue. So with these differences, those hair cells that have been damaged or destroyed, there is no way to repair them currently. We know science is working on this, and eventually one day they will be able to. But for now, if those hair cells are destroyed, that means those frequencies of sound are destroyed. So hearing aids amplify the range of speech sounds that are available to a degree. Cochlear implants provide electrical stimulus impulses that stimulate the auditory nerve. If there is an auditory nerve and if it's viable, those are also issues we run into. But they don't restore normal hearing. And that's the biggest thing to remember when working with deaf or hard of hearing learners, that just because they're successfully wearing technology doesn't mean they have or will ever have normal hearing. It's not like when we put on glasses and we can suddenly see clearly.
So this is a device, a hearing aid that would support a learner with a mild to severe sensorineural hearing level. I just tried to show you both examples because depending where you are in Ontario, these are the types of hearing aids that you will use for your learners. So the one on the left is a little bit bigger and typically used for our younger students. And then the one on the right is actually becoming a lot more popular because they are rechargeable, just like wireless earbuds would charge in a dock station overnight. So I wanted to show you a couple of examples of where the ear mold is present, because this is a really important part of the hearing aid for our students that helps them take autonomy over their hearing levels and have a choice. You can get any color made, you can have tie-dye, you can have glitter, but we really think it's important as teachers of the deaf to support our students in decision making, and then it helps them kind of take empowerment over their hearing levels as well. So as we move from right to left with the hearing aids on in the little graph there, you'll notice that they fit further and further in the canal. Typically, you're going to see a bigger hearing aid for our younger learners because the bigger the hearing aid is, the more amplification it's capable of, as well as you can pair them a lot easier to hearing assistive technology that we're going to talk about shortly as well. So this is an example of a cochlear implant. So a hearing aid is a device that would support a learner with a mild to severe sensorineural hearing level. And then a cochlear implant is one option that would support a student with a profound sensorineural hearing level. So a cochlear implant is a device that's implanted just under the skin, and it stimulates that auditory nerve using electrodes. So this is just one option for a baby that's born with a profound sensorineural hearing level. Parents can choose the cochlear implant route if they are wanting to learn a spoken language. And then at this point, with this type of hearing level, then a parent could also choose a visual signed language pathway as well for their child. So it really depends on where your child is followed by which hospital, and then which brand they would use. And then at different ages, they would implant students as well. Okay, so we talked a lot about the personal devices for our students. So why don't we take a look at hearing assistive technology? So hearing assistive technology typically just amplifies the educator's voice, and then it's sending those signals to the devices on your learner's ear. So here we see this is a personal microphone, or a, we said RM system, but you can also be known as an FM system or a DM system as well. And then we see a sound field system here where the teacher has a mic and it's amplifying their voice across the whole classroom. So again, it's beneficial for all the learners in the environment, but just necessary for our deaf and hard of hearing students that are wearing some sort of device. So the microphones for these types of systems, the DMs, the FMs, and the sound field systems, they kind of come in all different shapes and ways to wear them. I'm not going to go into too much depth with them, but this just shows the variety that there is across Ontario. So one of the tips for wearing these microphones is we supported a little girl who was in grade 3, and she said, my teacher turns on my microphone, puts it on their neck, and then adjusts it. And she said, it makes my teeth vibrate. So if you are using a microphone in your learning environment, just put it on, adjust, and then turn it on. And I think one of the tricks with this is just keeping it within that 6 inches from your speaker's mouth. If you're wearing any sort of scarves or any sort of jewelry, it can cause rustling and then actually mask the speaker's voice even more. One thing with these microphones that our students love to announce and let us know is when teachers forget to mute themselves and then they use the restroom, or they have a private conversation as well, because again, the students are privy, they're getting access to that information because it's going straight to their devices. So these are Tabral microphones, and again, it'll depend on what your student's audiologist has prescribed for your learners. So they're going to prescribe a personal device, whether it's a hearing aid, whether it's a conductive system, or a cochlear implant, of course. And then once they get into the school system, there is a lot of equipment available, but it will depend on what is prescribed for your actual student. So again, we just wanted to give you an idea of what is out there and how incredible this technology really is. So these types of microphones are made to support bigger groups of students that are talking in class discussions. So we have the table mic that can sit on a table and it will actually switch automatically to who is talking. Then we have the handheld mic, which was designed to be passed around from student to student, so that our students can not only locate who is speaking, but then attend to who is speaking as well. And then it also gives them that access to their peer responses and to their peers' thoughts and problem-solving skills as well. So because of the last couple of years, they have mic stands that would sit on the table and then students would line up rather than touching a mic and passing it around. And then the on that we see can clip to a teacher's clothing or be passed around or placed on a table as well. So we do want to show you this video because we think it really demonstrates how incredibly efficient this technology is. And not only that, but how necessary it is for our students to have access to language, to curriculum in the typical classroom. So this is a really good simulation because it shows what it sounds like listening through hearing aids. And then she's going to demonstrate the difference, and then again, the amplification that our students receive when she uses that FM system that's around her neck.
Hi, and welcome to our listening simulation. This is a classroom demonstration to show how students with hearing loss hear in the classroom despite noise and with the added benefit of Roger. You're currently listening to me through a pair of Sky NM 70 level hearing aids. They are programmed to a 30 dB flat loss, and they're being routed through the claim finder directly into the camera. Right now, my voice is only being heard through the hearing aids. While I am wearing a Roger touchscreen mic, you can tell that it's muted because of the flashing red light. We know for students with hearing loss, wearing their hearing technology, be it hearing aids, CIs, VAHAs, for their full wakeful day is critical, but unfortunately those devices aren't enough in the modern classroom, because there we have teachers who are moving around the classroom throughout the day and teaching as they go. We have peers discussing and learning from each other. And we have multimedia that augments the lessons. And studies have shown that classrooms can be as loud as 65 to 75 dB. That's as loud as a running vacuum cleaner. Imagine even trying to learn in that. So for our first simulation, we're actually going to turn on some classroom noise at 70 dB, and it'll be playing through a Bluetooth speaker. Today, children, we are going to learn about space exploration. With the Artemis project, NASA will land the first woman and the next man on the moon by 2024, using innovative technologies to explore more of the lunar surface than ever. Now I've unmuted the touchscreen mic, and I'm going to reteach that passage. I want you to think about the speech intelligibility and the level of effort that you have to put in to hear it. Today, children, we're going to learn about space exploration. With the Artemis project, NASA will land the first woman and the next man on the moon by 2024, using innovative technologies to explore more of the lunar surface than ever before. In the second part of the simulation, we're going to consider what happens in an interactive classroom when students have questions, but only the teacher has a microphone. Okay, class, we are going to conclude our unit on space this Friday with an exam, so this is your time to ask me any questions that you might have. Yes, Steve?
Is the test going to be open?
It will not be. So we're going to do that again now, and the next time Steve is going to use the pass-around mic. Okay, class, we are going to conclude our unit on space this Friday. Does anyone have any questions?
Is the test going to be open note?
No, it won't be, Steve. Now, for our student with hearing loss, they may not have heard Steve's question the first time around, or they may have misunderstood my answer. So that's where the pass-around mic becomes very helpful. This last part.
So again, this really just shows us how incredible this technology is and why it's really necessary for our learners that are wearing a device. She said that classrooms can get up to 65 to 75 dBs, which is a running vacuum. So can you imagine learning a language as a little one in that environment? And we have to think about, we want our students asking questions. We're encouraging our students to learn through inquiry and play, and those environments can get extremely loud. We have to think about when we're outside, just proximity to our learners as well. So this is when this technology becomes more of a sound equalizing system for our students, because regardless of where you are to the child in the classroom, your student is still getting access to the language that is around them.
And I think interesting too, we often, when I see this simulation, it's so good, but I think all those people talking while the teacher's talking wouldn't necessarily happen. But I always try to do a decibel meter app when I'm visiting childcare centers and daycares. And now with running HVAC systems and just really little kids, I was in a classroom, most of the kids were sick, so there were only 6 kids present, but they also had an HVAC system running. It was 75 dB in there consistently. So that's something that we have to keep in mind too.
Part of the simulation.
So it's my turn. Okay, so I am going to share a quick video now that just demonstrates some of the issues that kids with hearing differences often have to go through in their daily lives. Our colleague Darren, who is deaf, said this is, really typical, this part of incidental learning and the issues that this girl is having. So I'm going to share the video with you now. Here we go. It's called The Lost Joke.
Guys, check this out, right? Oh my God, you are not gonna believe this. You know how I was meant to be meeting Sophie after school last Friday, right? Well, I was meeting her on the bridge, yeah? And when I got there, guess what I saw? There was this group There was 3 of them, all in massive hats. Who's rocking around the corner but Jeff's mum, holding an enormous... It looked like a massive fish, right? She totally kissed that monkey. Totally landed the plane. But the best part, the absolute best part of the whole thing, and I've never seen anything like this. Okay, check this out. See you, man. Oh, we better get as well.
What was that last bit again? What happened?
I'll tell you later, okay?
So there's a whole lot to unpack in that video, and we don't have time to necessarily have a big conversation about it today. I wish we could talk more, but so many things happening. So we could see that as long as the speaker was looking at the girl with the hearing difference, she was able to connect with the message and hear most of the message. As soon as he turned away, she didn't have access anymore. And if we watched her behaviors, it's really typical of what our deaf and hard of hearing kids will do. They'll look around to their peers to see if they can get any more information that way. She was looking confused. We also know that the speaker put his hands up in front of his face. So when he turned his head away, she no longer had access to the message. It was loud in there because the listening environment wasn't that great, which we'll talk about more in a couple of minutes. Everybody was laughing, so there was more than one person's voice at the same time. So many things going on. And then the real typical thing at the end was when she asked him to repeat it, because that's what we tell our students. We say, if you don't catch something, if you don't hear it, ask for repetition, ask them to explain it again. And he said, don't worry about it, I'll tell you later. So we have to think about the number of times that probably happens in a day and the overall effect that's eventually going to have on self-esteem, on mental health and well-being, which is a really big issue these days. So typically I would have everyone kind of do an interactive activity on Mentimeter, but we have a small group and we're running short on time. So these are just some of the words that people usually type in to say they felt watching that video. They were confused, they were distracted, they were straining to hear, they tried to turn the volume up, they felt left out and not interested. And I think these are really typical words that describe what our students might be feeling in some of these activities in a learning environment. So some of the cascading impacts of hearing differences. And again, when Amy was talking about the difference between exposure and access, it's kind of the same thing when we talk about hearing versus listening. So we don't have to work at hearing. It's just something that happens. It's a response to sound. It happens as soon as a sound reaches our ear. Listening takes attention and intention, and it happens when the sound reaches our brain and our brain makes sense of it. So this puzzle just shows us that although our deaf and hard of hearing kids are hearing us, and if we ask them if they hear us, they'll say yes, 99% of the time, our job as educators is to be aware of that they're missing pieces of the puzzle and that they're not going to be able to construct meaning around a broken puzzle. So next I want to talk about audiograms. So an audiogram is a visual representation of how a person hears sound. The numbers down the left side of the audiogram represent how loud a sound has to be in decibels for a person to hear it. And we can kind of see some of these pictures demonstrate approximately how loud each of these sounds is. So 65 to 75 decibels we see down here. They show this dog barking, loud piano playing. The numbers across the top represent the pitch or frequency of a sound, and it's measured in hertz. This banana or bean-shaped area is often referred to as the speech banana, and that's where the majority of our speech sounds land with regards to pitch and loudness. So imagine that you had a hearing level of about 40 decibels. If we find the level 40 and imagine a straight line all the way across the audiogram, that falls into the mild to moderate hearing level. That means anything below this imaginary line, you would still have access to because your hearing level doesn't affect these sounds. But anything above the line, you would not have access to based on your hearing level. So that means you'd be missing quiet but really important sounds of speech, especially for those learning language. Things that make our words plural or possessive, those TH, those F sounds. So if your friend said, send me a GIF, does that mean you sent him a computer image or a present for someone's birthday? Because that ending would be inaudible. The important thing to remember about audiograms is they're just a snapshot of that moment in time when a child is in a booth, an audiologist booth. They don't really consider things like background noise. When you have a hearing test, you're in a quiet, soundproof booth. They play different sounds for you. They play them as pure tone beeps, one frequency at a time, louder and louder till you acknowledge that you heard it, and then it's plotted on this graph. But it doesn't take into consideration the rise and fall of my voice, the fact that I might be speaking louder if I'm really excited about something, or quieter if I'm trying to make sure other people don't overhear. It doesn't take into account that we co-articulate our sounds. We don't speak in single consonant sounds or single vowel sounds. We blend all those things together. A person's knowledge of or interest in the topic, all of those things affect how a person uses the hearing that they have available to them. This audiogram is plotted with a person's hearing level. So the round circles represent the right ear. We can remember round equals right, and the X is the left ear. This audiogram shows us that both ears have a similar hearing level. There's more hearing in the lower frequencies, and it slopes down to the severe level in the higher frequencies. And again, if you notice these pictures strewn about the audiogram, those show you what decibel and frequency each of those sounds resonates at. So again, this person would be able to hear a dog barking, the piano playing, the phone ringing, but they would not be able to hear the clock ticking or birds chirping, that sort of thing. So I have some software that can demonstrate this hearing level. This is very similar to what we just saw. So I'm going to play a couple of speech samples for you, and I'm playing different voices because they differ with regards to pitch and loudness. And I'm going to play them first without a hearing difference attached. So we're listening to them with a normal auditory system.
In 1836, Hans Christian Andersen published The Little Mermaid. In 1836, Hans Christian Andersen published The Little Mermaid.
And the woman.
In 1836, Hans Christian Andersen published The Little Mermaid. In 1836, Hans Christian Andersen published The Little Mermaid.
Now I'll hit the simulate hearing level button and we'll listen again.
In 1836, Hans Christian Andersen published The Little Mermaid. In 1836, Hans Christian Andersen published The Little Mermaid. In 1836, Hans Christian Andersen published The Little Mermaid. In 1836, Hans Christian Andersen published The Little Mermaid.
So if you're like me, you might have noticed that because we listened to them speak before I hit that simulate hearing level button, it almost made that hearing difference seem not as significant. So yes, we couldn't hear the word endings, the plurals were inaudible, but we could fill in the blanks because we were familiar with the script, and our brains do that. You might have noticed that your brain was automatically filling in those pieces that you missed. So think back to that puzzle that we just looked at. We had prior knowledge and pre-learning of their script. So now I'm going to play the child.
All the ocean, where the water is as blue as the prettiest cornflower and as clear as crystal. It is very, very far out in the ocean, where the water is as blue as the prettiest cornflower and as clear as crystal. It is very, very.
So that one was probably a lot more difficult. I'm not sure if people were able to catch any of the words that she said in there for a few different reasons, but the main one is that we had no context for what she was going to say. Her script was different. We hadn't heard it before. We had no pre-learning. Again, this kind of also explains the whole masking situation and the impact that masks have had on our little ones learning language, especially with the hearing difference. And how much more significant hearing differences are when you can't see a person's face. So remember, for children with hearing differences, they can't fill in the blanks. They don't have the benefits of years of language with an intact auditory system. We also have to remember that this simulation doesn't illustrate what it's like to listen with damaged hair cells. This simulation is more like a conductive hearing difference. So I'll remove the hearing level and we'll listen again.
Far out in the ocean, where the water is as blue as the prettiest cornflower and as clear as crystal, it is very, very deep. Far out in the ocean, where the water is as blue as the prettiest cornflower and as clear as crystal, it is very, very deep.
So also that audiogram didn't really consider background noise. So in that one, we were given a nice quiet background, and we know that the typical learning environment is really nothing like that. So this gives us a better idea of learning environments and what background noise does. We can also appreciate that even if hearing aids are being worn, hearing aids do amplify everything. So they're really good at being directional, the microphones, and picking up the speech signal, but they do still amplify the background noise as well. So thinking about the listening environment, these people are doing lots of great things. They're seated in an empty room, close together, face to face, and they're having a conversation. And then I'll start to add in the background noise.
Hey, do you want to play? Sure. What do you want to do? I don't know. Let's go see what the other kids are doing. That sounds good. Come on, let's go then. Okay. Hey, do you want to play? Sure. What do you want to do? I don't know. Let's go see what the other kids are doing. That sounds good. Come on, let's go then. Okay.
So you can see by the time I move that cursor all the way to the right, the speech signal for our student with hearing difference is completely lost. And this is a really typical listening environment for our students with hearing differences. It is extremely difficult for them to listen and learn in the presence of background noise. I would love to go into more detail about that. I'm being mindful of the time here. So I'm going to switch back to our PowerPoint. So I alluded to this a little bit earlier about some misconceptions. One is that hearing and listening are the same. We know that they're not, and I explained it a little bit earlier. We know that speaking more loudly does not help to improve comprehension for our learners, although I know I fall into the trap too. If anything, speaking more loudly just distorts your mouth movements and it puts extra stress on the vowels. And we know that the meaning of language is carried through the consonant sound. So that does not really assist our learners. Deaf children are not necessarily good speech readers. We know many deaf and hard of hearing people do rely on some lip reading in conjunction with many other facial features and body language. But there are many reasons why lip reading is not something that can be used reliably. We know that technology does not provide normal hearing, nor does it guarantee comprehension. And the final misconception that we often talk about when we visit schools is the difference between speech and language. So again, speech is just a physical act. It's using our articulators, our tongue, teeth, lips, cheeks to make sounds, but language is what we do with those sounds. It's being able to understand conversation, read a story, write something, have a conversation, ask questions, answer questions. We wanted to talk a little bit about ideal listening environments and how to make our environments more listener friendly. This is what we know to be the ideal situation. The World Health Organization recommends that the ambient noise in a room be no greater than 35 decibels for the best listening and learning environment. The American Speech and Hearing Association recommends that the reverberation in a room be no greater than 0.4 seconds. Reverberation is that sound that hangs around after bouncing off of hard surfaces like floors, desks, windows, smart boards, basically everything that makes up our learning environment for students. The signal to noise ratio needs to be plus 15 decibels for children with normal hearing levels and plus 20 for children with levels below normal. So what that means is that the desired signal, which is the educator's voice, needs to be 15 to 20 decibels louder than the background noise to be able to be heard clearly. And finally, the recommendation is that students are seated no more than 6 feet away from the sound source at all times. So these things aren't manageable in regular days. And now, given all the COVID things that we're still dealing with, it's next to impossible. The reality is that the typical background noise in a learning environment is 41 to 51 decibels when the room is empty. And that's just based on lighting making noises, on HVAC systems. And as we keep saying, students are still hearing you, they're just not getting the whole message. And then we add in students and they're coughing and scraping furniture on the floor. More of that speech signal gets lost. Reverberation in a typical classroom is up to 1.25 seconds. The higher the time, the more cloudy that message gets. Classroom seating, we know it's impossible to have all students within 6 feet of the sound source at all times, which is why technology and HAT equipment is so important. The diagram on the left represents how the speech signal drops the further away a person gets. So at a distance of about 4 feet, the listener is usually able to hear the whole message. When the person's 8 feet away, distance alone is already causing the speaker's voice to be almost equal to that of background noise. And by the time the person is 16 feet away, the speech signal is lower than the background noise of most classrooms. And again, that signal to noise ratio. So if we consider that we usually speak at about a 50 to 60 decibel level, that's where normal conversation occurs. And we know that we need to keep our voices 20 decibels higher than that for an ideal signal to noise ratio. Can you imagine how loudly we'd have to be speaking all day long for our deaf and hard of hearing children to have good access? Face it, we can't, none of us can keep that up all day long. And this kind of diagram demonstrates the importance of signal to noise ratio. If the speech signal is equal to that of the background noise, we can see how difficult it will be to get meaning out of that message. We can work really hard at it. We can peer at it very closely, but we couldn't keep up that level of energy all day long. The bottom white boxes at the bottom here show us how properly fit technology supports, but we can also see it doesn't make things perfect for our learners either. So we need to start considering some of the background distractions, and that's the best way to go towards making our environment more listener friendly, is to become mindful of them. We know HVAC systems make lots of noise. We know noise comes from the kids themselves. Pencil sharpeners, fluorescent lighting, computers, all of those things contribute to the noise level in the room. So some things we can do, we try to keep the doorways closed whenever possible. We can break up very large spaces into smaller learning environments so our voice doesn't have to travel so far. We can ensure good lighting so that our learners do have access to our facial features. We know we can't do all of these things, but even one or two can be helpful for our learners.
So we're going to look specifically at deaf and hard of hearing education through a teacher's lens, because that's Kristi and my background. But I think it's really important that as educators, we are gap closers. So we're looking at our students' strengths and areas of need. And really our goal as deaf and hard of hearing teachers for all of our deaf and hard of hearing students in Ontario are to be learning on an accommodated only IEP, so that individual education plan. So we want to make sure that we're educating parents about the difference between accommodations versus modifications. We want to make sure that we're having those ongoing conversations with the hearing resource team as well, because that's how, as a group, we can best support the learning environment for that little one to achieve student success. So let's take a look at some accommodations that we can implement. And again, we're going to look kind of specifically at the IEP. First and foremost, I think the most important is just consistently using the devices that your student's audiologist has prescribed. Then secondly, we can look at the speech bubble. Ideally, in deaf education, you want to be in a 3-foot radius from your learner, but we know that's impossible at all times. That's why making sure your student is wearing their devices, if you have access to those DMs, those FMs, or the little mini clips, sometimes you do in preschools, definitely using those. If you're working in a circle, the recommendation is that the student sits at a 45-degree angle from you, only so that they have access to your face as the educator, but then they have access to their peers as well. Because like Kristi said, they need to see those speech, those language cues that are happening on their faces or on your face as the educator. We can reduce background noise in the classroom. Kristi talked a little bit about that reverberation, that noise that's bouncing off of things. So making your learning environment a little bit smaller, even just dividing up play centers really supports learners. Having hush-ups or flexi felt on the bottoms of chairs, especially because we've had to remove rugs recently. And then we're not having those scraping chairs on tile floors, but even blinds, cork boards. If you have rugs in your learning environment, that really helps dampen those sounds that are bouncing off the classroom walls for the little one. So when we talk about group work, we know it gets loud in these learning environments, and that's okay because we want our students to be asking questions, and that's really how our students are learning probably the most efficiently, when they're learning from others and how they're learning walking through those problems. So even if we limit the number of students in that group, maybe we could provide them with a quieter space in the school or in the classroom to work. And then of course, providing those hearing assistant microphones in the group if they're prescribed by your audiologist. We can support our students with visual cues. So really it's pre-teaching, it's context. It's a lot of, Kristi, do you mind just flipping to the next slide as well? Really, it's just any sort of visual support for our learners in the learning environment, especially when we notice a lot of times the deaf and hard of hearing learner will rely on cues from their peers in the classroom. So that can cause a lot of anxiety. So this is really a great accommodation that supports all the learners in the learning environment, but supports the deaf and hard of hearing student as well. And then potentially it's relieving that transition anxiety. So again, we're getting their attention before we start our instruction or give them that message. We can identify the speaker with a hands up, or we're using gestural cues. You can even use flick a light, a lot of teachers use attention getting songs like hands on top, that means stop, but everybody will locate the educator and then attend to them in a timely manner so that all of our students are receiving that information rather than relying on cues from their peers in the classroom. So a buddy system we have found works fabulously across the province. A lot of times we put the onus of advocating for yourself, but that can be exhausting for our little ones, especially when they start into the school setting when they're only 4 or 5. So pairing them kind of with a reliable friend really supports. We have seen buddy systems that remind the teacher if the FM system isn't working or they have forgotten to turn it on. We've seen buddy systems work really well when we rely on a lot of our information being shared in the school setting by an auditory PA system that can be very old and crackly. And that's really hard to hear that information through a device. So a buddy would just write on the chalkboard, on the whiteboard, just what the PA is saying, and then therefore giving them a visual access as well for our students. So an auditory access is so important for our learners. And like we saw in that simulation, there's a lot going on, and we have to remember that devices amplify all the sounds that are happening around our learner. So again, implementing a one voice rule, We know this can be really challenging depending on the age of the students that you're working with, but again, it's just giving them access to what is happening around them and their peers' responses as well. We want to allow extra time for processing. Like Kristi showed us in that video, there's a lot that has to be working correctly in a sequence for us to even be able to hear at those normal levels. So adding in hearing assistive technology and listening through a device, we just want to make sure that they hear our message, process our message, and then are able to respond appropriately as well. I don't think we have time for this video, Kristi, sorry. So we want to do a lot of frequent checks in for understanding, because I even know with myself, if people say, do you understand? We know kids will nod and shake their head yes. So we want to try to avoid the use of yes or no questions, because do you understand? We know the majority of our class will nod their head yes. So we want to show me what your next step is, or show me what the last thing you were working on. And then again, you're seeing how much of the message they're receiving, and then also understanding as well. So even rewording and rephrasing of information is really critical to support our DHH learners. We know that listening fatigue is real for our students that are listening and focusing on discriminating those background noises compared to those important speech signals. Listening through a device is chronically exhausting. So just implementing listening breaks for our younger ones, that might just mean taking them to a quieter space in the learning environment. It doesn't necessarily mean taking their device out. Even just narrating and modeling, oh, it's really loud in here, let's move to a quieter space, will support their self-advocacy skills in the future as well. Can we just skip this one? I'm just thinking we're really short on time. Placement is something that we maybe wouldn't ever think about, but when I just moved one step to the right, that dark shadow over my face would really be challenging to have a conversation with. So if you have a little one, make sure that the lights are at the back behind them rather than as the educator. And then we have to think about the more informal times that our students are experiencing in the learning environment as well. So again, we talked about announcements, assemblies, outdoor learning, any of the time that our students don't have that direct access to us potentially. But again, proximity, and then those strategies that we've talked about. I know we're very limited, but I think one of the most important ways to create an inclusive environment is supporting students and letting them see themselves in the literature that is in the classroom as well. So there's this book list that's really, which we can send you more books for sure. On the next slide, we can support learners by even having professional character studies of successful professional deaf and hard of hearing learners. Paula McDonald is absolutely incredible. She's working at, or she's not working, she's studying at Carleton University. There's the new Deaf Marvel character. And then even Marsha Ireland is creating a signed language to connect with her culture as well. I mean, there are so many ways that we can support these learners in the classroom to show them that they're not the only ones that are wearing hearing aids or using the sign language in their environment too. And I think that was it. Sorry, that was really fast. Very rushed at the end.
Was rushed. I feel like that was like 4